I'm John V. My guest is Paul Womack. He's a Tennessee native who did his undergraduate work at Middle Tennessee State University, earned a Master of Divinity from Vanderbilt, another master's from Canisius, and a doctorate from Colgate-Rochester. His military service began as a lieutenant in military intelligence and concluded when he retired as division chaplain from the headquartered 98th Division, U.S. Army Reserve. He served Methodist churches in Tennessee, Buffalo, Kenmore, and Rochester before becoming pastor of Hurlbert Church on the grounds of Chautauqua Institution. Paul, welcome to Chautauqua people.
Thank you.
How did you make your way to Chautauqua?
Well, I was serving a church in Buffalo, and I received a phone call from our district superintendent, the person in the United Methodist system that negotiates these matters, and he called and asked me if I would be interested in coming to Hurlbert at Chautauqua. And I ran it by my wife, who is a native of Jamestown and Westfield, and she was quite affirming about this as a possibility. So I came down and fell in love with the people and the church and the institution, and it was a great place to be for a while.
And you served how long in Hurlbert?
I was 6 years at Hurlbert.
6 years. Now, your 18-year service in Rochester was the longest of several positions. What was unique about your time there?
In Rochester, I had the opportunity to engage in interfaith and ecumenical activities. So we had Jewish-Christian conversations, we had Christian-Muslim conversations, we had Jewish-Christian-Muslim conversations, and at one point we had 28 different religious organizations involved in what was called the Interfaith Forum, and ways of trying to connect with people in spite of our different religious traditions, looking for common ground, not only in matters of spirit, but matters of what would serve the common good for the Rochester community. And those were great years.
Where did these meetings take place?
We met in churches, we met in synagogues, we met at the mosque, we met at the Hindu temple, we met wherever the host group gathered their community is where we would have our meetings when we were engaging that particular community.
Tell me a little more about that.
Well, it was a way of trying to get a sense of the physical space that a community would have and let them offer us their hospitality and sometimes their food, and so it was a way of connecting, in which say for a Christian, you left your turf and went to someone else's. So you were the guest, they were the host, and those were quite amazing conversations, actually.
Were they mostly clergy or lay people? Or?
Clergy and lay, but mostly religious leaders. Mm-hmm. We had the time to do this, but I had a number of good friends in Rochester who were members of the Islamic community, and they may have an imam in their mosque, but they're basically lay people who lead those situations.
And what was the outcome of this?
Well, interestingly, I'll refer back to the events of September the 11th in 91. When those towers fell, we got on the phone with each other and we agreed to meet, and we met at the mosque on Westfall Road in Rochester. Mm-hmm. And early that afternoon we had a statement from this group of interfaith persons to the Rochester community about that horror and that terrible event, and that we as a religious society, we were unified. And I remember the statement began something like this: today we're all Christians, we're all Jews, we're all Muslims, we're all Americans. And if we had not had significant conversations before that happened, I'm not sure we could have gotten together that quickly on that terrible day.
What kind of reaction did you hear from working with folks of different faiths?
A lot of appreciation, a lot of gratitude, a lot of understanding of who we were, and understanding about who they were and the cultures and the traditions and ways to challenge misunderstandings and misapprehensions about a particular group. And you know, you just build these bridges of understanding, as I call them.
Right. And you go back and do it again, methinks.
Oh, in a heartbeat.
And what was it like to, having had this experience in Rochester, and then to Buffalo, you got a call from the higher up saying, wouldn't you like to go to Chautauqua? And your bride is a native of the area, and she says, well, of course, dear, I want to go home. What was it like to pastor Hurlbert Church?
Well, you have to make a distinction between the church and the community. At least I do as a United Methodist pastor. I believe we're appointed to a community, and our congregation happens to be in that community. Our building may be in that community. But the persons to whom I wanted to be a pastoral presence or a friend was anybody at Chautauqua or anybody I met in Mayville or Jamestown or Sherman or wherever. And so you do like double duty. Hurlbert's congregation has souls who come from all over the area. People might think, well, they're all Chautauquans who live inside the grounds. No, they come from all over. And we had very few who lived inside the institution. And, you know, people, interesting careers and interesting backgrounds and interesting faith perspectives. And it was a great joy of my life to be their pastor for 6 years, and what a great church to retire from. You know, and they know how to put a party on, and you know, the whole thing was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I really have fallen in love with Chautauqua and Chautauqua County.
And so that church continues.
Yes.
Now, how has it changed over the years?
In the old days, it's my understanding that it was really the congregation for the institution, leadership, and people who lived on the grounds. And as that ethos changed, then that changed the nature of the church. And institution persons of faith go to churches all over the area. And so we have to, you know, we did our best to, anybody was welcome, and it's not a particularly large numerically significant church, but it has a lot of spirit and tries very hard to engage the life of the institution during that summer season. And you know, I like the idea that it's a spiritual welcoming center, and we try to do that year round. The summer, of course, is always the highlight of that activity.
That continues during the season, or off season. Now, one of the things that we heard about coming from that church was the Paul Womack Food Basket Program. Explain yourself.
Well, I'm a little shy about that. I didn't do this. It was a friend of mine at Chautauqua, a dear friend who felt like this would be another way the institution could engage the community. And so he had this idea. We set up this food basket fund. And then he had the bright idea they should name it after me, which was, you know, it's a nice honor and it's sweet. What's important is that they raise funds and are able to help people at the Thanksgiving, Christmas period. And that's really what I like about it.
And who were the people they typically helped?
Well, I wasn't involved in any of that. They worked with social services in Chautauqua County, and they would get the names of persons who likely would benefit, and that's who they would reach out to.
So people who may not be well enough fed
right.
at this holiday time, then
right.
you go through and get them. And therefore not identified by a faith test.
No.
But identified by what social services would indicate.
Yeah, or a human test. They're just human beings.
Indeed, indeed. What are you currently doing at Chautauqua?
My wife and I were fortunate enough to be able to be the host couple at the United Methodist Missionary Vacation Home. There are a number of denominational places at Chautauqua. And this house has been engaged in ministry since 1920. And over the years, it evolved from being a place of hospitality for missionaries only to the situation now where anybody needs a place to stay, contact me, and if we have the space, we'll arrange for you to have a room at Chautauqua, and we'll feed you some meals, and we'll take your contribution in return. So it's like as my wife says, it's like a big boarding house now in the summer. And it's a lot of fun because we have folks from all over the country and lots of diversity, and we have a great porch, and there's some wonderful conversations on that porch and around the table when it's mealtime.
And so you live in this big house, Lakefront House.
Yeah.
And what was the first incarnation of that house?
It began as there was some property there, and Mr. Studebaker, as I understand it, my wife is more the expert, bought the property, tore the house down that was there, built this house that now occupies the space, and then it was lived in for a while by his daughter or a son, I'm not sure which, and then it belonged to a Mr. Truesdale, who helped to build Hurlbert Church, actually.
Really?
And there's a Truesdale Hall at Hurlbert. And after a few years, Mr. Truesdale gave it to the Women's Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church to become this respite place for missionaries when they were home on leave from wherever they were assigned. And it's been operating since, as I said, 1920. Of course, we don't have anybody there this year, but there's always next year.
That's right. So indeed, it looks like a great place. I walk dogs by there and seen you up on the porch since we've gotten to know one another here. Let's switch gears a little bit. And you've had two careers, the military career and the clergy career, and the two merged. So how long was your military service, both active and reserve?
Well, I was in college in the 60s. I graduated in 1968. And in the summer where I went to college was a land grant school, so you had 2 years of compulsory ROTC, Reserve Officers Training. And I wasn't too keen on that, too regimented, that sort of thing. So I did not take what they call advanced ROTC. But between my junior and senior year, I was in a conversation with the professor of military science, a dear man named James Kritzberg. And Colonel Kritzberg said to me, "Paul, what are your plans when you graduate?" I said, "Well, I hope to go to law school." And he said to me, "Well, the war is not going to be over." And he said, "That's going to have to factor into your thinking." He said, "Why don't you sign up for advanced ROTC and have some choice about your military service?" He said, "Because they're going to be looking for you when you graduate." And I found him very persuasive, actually. So I took all of this ROTC my senior year, graduated, went to Fort Bragg for what they call summer camp, was commissioned at Fort Bragg, went to Fort Benning to infantry school, went to Fort Bliss, Texas, of all places, to study the Vietnamese language, went back to Fort Hurlbert to have a brief intelligence course, and then went to Vietnam, where for 10 months I was primarily interrogation team leader. And that whole experience wrought great transformations in my heart and mind. And so when I came back from Vietnam, I went to seminary. I had questions I needed to answer, and I didn't know where to go to get the answers. I had moral questions. And so I went to seminary, and after 4 years in seminary, my reserve time ended, and I was discharged. And then a few years later, I was contacted about coming back into the reserve system. So at the age of 42, I went back in the Army and stayed until I was almost 61.
Now, did you have to go through some additional training then at age 42?
At 42, I went to the chaplain's basic course.
But that was tough.
Well, it was not too bad. It wasn't as bad as infantry school. Let's put it that way. And but because I was prior service, you know, I sort of knew what to expect. And then, like any military branch, you have lots of schools. So I did the advanced course, and I did a course on being an installation chaplain, and I did a course on being a division chaplain. And I took as many opportunities for the military to educate me as I could. And in the reserve system, I just sort of bumped up until the division slot was available, and I took that.
And along the way, you did a master's at Canisius.
I did.
And what was that in?
Religious studies.
Okay. And then the Dmin?
At Colgate, Rochester, the generic track would be church history.
Right.
But I wrote a dissertation on religious conversion, which was interesting.
Okay. And where were you when you did the Dmin program?
It's interesting. I was living in Kenmore when I started my coursework, so I would commute from Buffalo to Rochester in the sunshine, in the rain, in the snow.
The snow.
And when I finished my coursework, I was moved to Rochester. I lived about 2 blocks from the seminary. Okay. And I just thought, well, why couldn't I have had all that coursework when I was living on Rockingham Street in Rochester? Mm-hmm. But, you know, I didn't. It worked out okay.
And then you were Dr. Paul.
And then I was.
Now, did you use that doctorate? Is it identification in your ministry?
I used it for my own educational purposes in terms of insight into preaching and sometimes counseling. I taught a little bit using some of the information I got. You know, for me, a person's faith just develops over time, and it's sort of like this, and it may back up, and those insights were helpful. Mm-hmm.
Now, during your time progressing as a Army Reserve chaplain, were you ever called to active duty?
I went to Desert Storm. I was called up in October of '90, I guess it was, and went down to Fort Pickett, Virginia. And then from there, I joined a unit from Connecticut at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and I went to Desert Storm with that unit. I guess that was in '91.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of unit was that?
It was a medical clearing company, which is like a floating emergency room. And we were prepared to treat chemically wounded soldiers primarily. So we had a lot of training in how you deal with nerve gas. A lot of anxiety when we were over there because we were pretty close to the border. And we followed the 1st Division across the border on the 26th of February. And we had some casualties. We had a pretty rough trip. And that was a tough tour.
And how long were you overseas then?
I was over there for, I was on active duty 7 or 8 months. I guess we were overseas about 4.
And so you were there for the big push in February '91.
Indeed, yeah.
And the division advanced and did very well, did it not?
Well, they did. They moved very quickly across that desert. That desert's a big place, and I got lost in it once, and that's a story for offline.
Okay.
But they were wonderful people to be with, medical doctors and medics, and they were highly skilled, and they were quite prepared to do the job. Fortunately, we just did not have the number of casualties we were expecting, and I'm glad for that. But we did have an incident where we had some of our own personnel were killed and wounded, and that weighs on me still.
You had some. And then were you called up a later time?
I went back over in 2004.
13 years later.
13 years later. I was an old man then, and went back to, actually went back into Kuwait initially, and we were up in Kuwait for a training operation, and we were at the very location where we had this incident that killed 2 of my company mates in '91, and that was a very spooky moment. But I ended up at a place called Taji, which is north of Baghdad, which had been a major Iraqi base. And I was there for about 4 months, and then I got very sick. Mm-hmm. And so I was rotated back to the States and stayed on active duty in the States while another chaplain took my place in Iraq.
Were you hospitalized when you got back here?
No, they pumped me full of antibiotics, and when I got off the plane, the general said, take 2 weeks and see how you're doing. And I think I just needed the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And I know one moment I was over there, and this Army captain, this Green Beret, came over to see me, and he said, Chaplain, some of us have been observing you. And I said, yeah. He said, you know, we think you're kind of old to be over here. And I said, yeah, no kidding. And I think that was just part of it, the stress and the activity, and just wasn't a place for I thought I could do it physically, but I wore out, and part of it had to do with the death of a soldier in 2004 that I had talked to at the dining facility.
Mm-hmm.
Was killed a couple of days later.
Tough.
And, you know, I just thought.
Now, let's tie these two together. Is the Methodist Church a confessing church?
Does it have like a
formal confession? Would a pastor be trained in a Methodist church to take confessions from?
Oh, and that's it? No. No, we're trained as pastors to, if someone needs to unburden themselves to us, we'll of course, you know, sit with that person and hear it. There's not any sort of like sacrament of absolution.
Got it.
But most pastors, including me, have a lot of secrets in us that people have told us over the years.
And did you take confessions from soldiers?
I did.
How was that?
Well, tender. People would need to unburden something on their heart or their mind, and it wasn't always a matter of some guilt or some transgression. It just was, they were just perplexed and puzzled by their lives in that situation. And we would just sit and talk, and I would hear their concerns. I did hear some guilt confessions, and I've remarked that I was asked once by an investigator if I knew what had happened in a particular episode, and I said I thought I did, and he said, will you tell me? And I said no, because I couldn't. And he said, have a nice day, and I said, you have a nice day, and I went my way and he went his way.
It sounds like those deployments are where you earned your pension.
Well, thank you.
And that's it. How does the work of a military chaplain compare with that of a church pastor?
Well, a church pastor is, you know, you're localized in your denomination. A military chaplain works as part of a larger team of people, and you don't focus on a particular denomination, or at least I didn't. One of my favorite stories is a soldier asked me one day what kind of chaplain I was, and I think he must have wanted to know my denomination. And I said, it depends on what kind of chaplain you need today. And if there was a soldier need, a liturgical need, or religious need that I could not fulfill, then it was always my role to go find a chaplain who could meet that particular need. But it's quite an ecumenical ministry, and actually interfaith ministry. And we all support each other. And you serve as the commander's religious advisor for his unit, but you work with other chaplains to make sure that the soldier needs, as well as the family of the soldier, that those needs are addressed and cared for. And when I was back in the States in 2005, after my brief tour to Iraq, that's what I did. A lot of family ministry, because their soldier, man, a husband or a wife, a son or a daughter, was overseas, and I would try to help that family deal with that reality.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard work. Now, tell me about your retirement. I want to tell me about the little pin you're wearing on your left lapel there.
Well, this is a Legion of Merit, which they gave me when I retired, which I appreciated. And some people call it an attaboy medal, but I took it as an indication that they had some respect for the work I had done. And then when I retired from the church, went back to Tennessee, where I had grown up, to be with my elderly parents, and said I was going to read all the books in my library that people thought I had already read. And that's pretty much what I've been doing. Some preaching, and every now and then I'll talk to a soldier who's I get it put in touch with, or a veteran. But by and large, I read my books and I walk my dog and try to be a good citizen.
Good. A couple of questions I would like to finish with. And here's one that I just think is important for every person who comes to this table. And if a young Chautauquan came to you, expressed an interest in a career of church work, and asked for advice, what would be your counsel?
Well, I would ask some questions. I would try to help that person discern or ascertain where that calling had come from. Was it this person's heart that was directing them, or was it trying to fulfill somebody else's need on their behalf? And I think that's true for any vocation. But I'd want to make sure that that individual was pretty clear about this calling. And then I would try to help them understand some of the dimensions of the work and some of the sacrifices it involves. Every vocation I know is different. Every vocation is unique. Just like every veteran story is unique. No veteran can speak for all veterans. No pastor can speak for all pastors. But there really needs to be some clarity about the calling and some understanding about what you're going to be dealing with in that vocation. And I would try to help that person ascertain that.
Go from there.
Go from there.
I always like to give the person who's talking here sort of a last chance. We call it the bottom of the ninth at bat. What else haven't we covered that really needs to be said from your life experience?
Well, I misspoke earlier. I said the Twin Towers, I said 1991. That was 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And so I need to correct that little historical oversight. But, you know, there's a thing in life, or a thing in theology called providence. And I look back at my life and, you know, okay, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't. Thought about being a college professor. I wasn't. I was an Army chaplain and I was a local church pastor. And I've done those things, and I think there has to be providence in that for me. I'm pretty satisfied with my life. I think I've made some contributions to some people. I know I have stubbed my toe several times, and I probably have wounded some souls. But by and large, on the balance, I hope I've been a good man, and I hope I've made a difference with my life, and I hope I still do for another 20 or 30 years.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing with us on Chautauqua People.
Appreciate it.
If this was a normal day, we'd reach across and shake each other's hand, but this is the best we're going to do in these days of COVID.
Yeah. Be safe.
And do come back.
Thank you.